Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
and I'm Stephen Park, and we are here for our last read of Pachinko, and honestly, I had no idea what Pachinko was before I read this book. I've heard of it, I think, but apparently, so as we're reading, we're finding out that it's this gambling machine. It's utilized in different settings to try to lure people in, and it kind of sounds like Vegas in a way.
Well, it is a gambling machine, so yes, I guess it is Vegas-like, and it has pins so that when you drop in like a ball or a coin or something, it like hits those pins and you're trying to get it to shoot into a particular slot in order to get a payout. But because it's manipulated, most times, most people don't get the payout that they're looking for.
I actually remember where I think I've heard it from now. Have you ever watched the show Price is Right?
Yes.
I think there was a giant pachinko board where you drop these giant discs.
Yeah.
And then it drops down, and then you win a prize if it gets to the right one or something. I think that's where I've heard of it.
For sure.
But I've never played it, actually. But I have gone to Vegas and tried different forms of gambling, whether it's cards, whether it's dice, the slot machines. I think it kind of runs in my bloodline a little bit. I don't know. I feel like Korean people or at least the ones that I know in America, love to go to the ones that were closest to us were like Pachanga or Morongo casinos. I think it also runs in the bloodlines of the Filipino moms and the grandmothers that I know.
Well, there's bingo, yes.
Oh yeah, bingo's another
and
big one.
And cards among men.
Yeah.
Generally.
Yeah.
But I grew up in a very heavily religious home. So there was no gambling. I've never gambled. I've been to Vegas, but I would just watch and look at other people doing things and not participate myself. Or, for example, I would go to the Philippines and we would go to casinos, and again, I would just be an onlooker who's not actually joining in on the actual gambling.
Right. For me, gambling always just felt hard to do because I always equated it to money that I didn't really have. So I think a lot of times early on going to Vegas, it was more for like going to clubs or going to eat things. So it'd be with my friends. So the primary thing was the events that we were going to do at night, and it wasn't the gambling.
For sure.
So by the time I got to the gambling aspect, the way I honestly started thinking about gambling was in the value of tacos that I would get, and not just like normal tacos, but the tacos from Jack in the Box. Yeah. So Jack in the Box has had this deal. I think it's still there, but you would get 2 tacos for $1. I think now it might be like $1.10 or something, but you would get 2 tacos for $1. So then if I'm putting in a $20 buy-in, which is just the base price, like, man, that's 40 tacos. And if it continues to add on and pile on, then I could easily be at 200 tacos.
Right. It becomes exponential.
Yeah, and by the end of the day, I might have lost 1,000 tacos. So it was really hard to wrap my mind around that. And it was even worse if I started thinking about it in the form of nuggets, like chicken nuggets, because back then it used to be 20 pieces for $5. It might just be the Asian side of me, the cheap Asian side of thinking about money in the form of possession and things that you could have.
But it's food. I think that's what makes it different. It's not just possessions. You're not thinking about shoes. You're not thinking about a car. You're thinking about sustenance, which is different.
Yes. So, although this may be my eating patterns, I'm pretty sure that our recommendation for this week won't eat Jack in the Box tacos. But let's go into that recommendation.
Alright, so our recommendation for the week is to look up the work of Skylar Bailar. Skylar Bailar is the first trans Division I NCAA men's athlete in swimming. He is an inclusion advocate and a celebrated inspirational speaker, and what he's known for is sharing his story about how during his senior year in high school, he realized that his body image issues and figuring out his gender identity meant he had to decide between continuing swimming to become a possible NCAA champion or transitioning, being true to himself while accepting the consequences that entailed. His story has shown up in many places, but he chronicles it on his Instagram at Pink Manta Ray. And you can learn more about his advocacy work and the different groups and organizations he's partnering with at pinkmantaray.com.
Yeah, and that's our recommendation for the week. Okay, so last read of Pachinko. We are finalizing the book 3 read from chapters 9 through 21. Mm-hmm. This takes us all the way to the end.
Yes.
But what did we figure out last week?
So we figured out last week that so many different events happened all at once. So we ended up focusing on the relationships within those chapters. We focused on Masasu and Yumi, who unfortunately Yumi passes away. Masasu and Natsuko, who is his new girlfriend, we don't know about yet, but we will be finding out soon. And then Masasu and Haruki, who is his best friend who moved closer to him during our last read. Then Haruki and Ayame, they're spouses, and we figured out that they were finding not safe for work places to indulge. We also talked about Sunja and Hansu and how they were starting to reconnect because they were both looking for Noah, which brings us to the relationship between Noah and Akiko, who becomes his ex-girlfriend. Noah finding out and figuring out that his relationship with Hansu is actually closer, meaning that he's his father, which meant that he leaves Sunja, thus him disappearing. And in his disappearance, marrying Risa, his wife, who doesn't know he's Korean. So all of that to say, so many different relationships, so many webs, so many things that happened.
Mm-hmm. And this time around, we come to wrapping up the book, and I think Min Jin Lee does such a great job of it.
She does a good job of it, and very similar to last week, rather than focusing on the events, it seemed that the events were starting to come together through themes. And one of those themes is truth-telling. And by truth-telling, I mean that these characters are spewing out whatever comes to their mind and not having any filters. Mm-hmm. And one of those is, like we started mentioning earlier in the recap, is Atsuko. Before this last section, we were wondering, who is she? Where does she come from? What does she do? And how is she coming into this mix of this family? Mm-hmm. And we learn more about that. What do you think of Atsuko after reading this portion?
So Atsuko, her life is described pretty heavily in the book.
Uh-huh.
Even though she comes in at the tail end of the whole story.
Yeah.
We gain a lot of insight about who she is as a person. So just to kind of briefly go over Atsuko. So she's now the person who is dating Masasu. And they are now in Tokyo together, but that's not where she started off. Mm-hmm. She started off in Hokkaido, and when she was about 16, 17 is when she started being a little bit more sexually adventurous, and that led her to get pregnant around the age of like 16 or 17. Mm-hmm. She ended up having, I think, 3 or 4 kids. 3 children.
Yeah.
But because of her sexual nature, her husband did find out that she was cheating on him, and then that ended up in a divorce because of the manner of both the time and what was happening. She would not be able to gain custody of the children. Mm-hmm. So that's when she left her life in Hokkaido to come to Tokyo. Mm-hmm. So in Tokyo, she meets Masasu. And through this relationship is where we learn a little bit more about Asuko, because she doesn't want to marry Masasu, even though he treats her extremely well. And from different inferences, we see that Masasu wants to marry her. He's brought multiple wedding rings to her as a way of proposal.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of Atsuko, she's had all this history that she believes has put a blemish on her children's lives. Her children have been affected by the fact that her acts are now more public in Hokkaido. And so now she doesn't want to put more shame or more trouble onto her children by marrying a Korean pachinko owner.
Totally. And this leads us to Hana, who is her only daughter, who then kind of spews out the truth that even though Atsuko, and that's the nature of Hana is very, very
open and honest.
Open, honest. I think the word I'm looking for is frank.
Mm-hmm.
Hana says that even though Atsuko thinks she is trying to be noble in protecting her children,
Mm-hmm.
Hana says that she's never thought about her children because she left them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really just her being selfish and being worried about her own self-image
Mm-hmm.
and her reputation.
Mm-hmm.
Which, again, ties back to Mozazu being a pachinko manager.
Right. And we also get to learn a little bit more about Hana through Atsuko.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing we find out about Hana is her pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
So Hana now enters the story because she is pregnant and she doesn't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
She is now coming to Atsuko for help because she doesn't believe that her father could give her help.
Well, we don't know that for sure. I just know that from what I read, it seemed like the only person she can turn to is her mom because she asked her mom if she could speak to her like a friend, and she's the only friend she has.
Right. And so Atsuko ends up helping Hana with an abortion, and this is how Hana enters our book, which
yes,
she actually ends up playing a pretty big role in.
But before we talk about Hana and the big role that she plays, let's talk about the one last truth-telling person is Youngjin, Sunja's mother. And in this section, we learn that Youngjin is slowly deteriorating. She is no longer able to get out of bed. She can't really do anything. So the only thing that she does do is spill everything that she's been holding in about Sunja and her decisions, specifically with Hansu.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, she kind of just fires everything at her, like, this is your fault, you should have known better, because you did this act with Hansu, Noah's gone,
Mm-hmm.
and essentially just blaming her for everything that's happened to her family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is with Youngjin on her deathbed.
Right.
In the book, she mentions that she believes that she has 2 days to live,
Mm-hmm.
and pretty soon after that, it just mentions that Youngjin had passed away.
Right.
Whether that is her permission to start opening up and telling the truth, or if that's more of the act of someone who is kind of approaching the fear of death, we don't really know the true meaning of it, but we know that this directly affects Sunja. Luckily, Kyung-hee's there to kind of placate the whole situation a little bit.
Right.
But definitely not the best daughter-mother relationship to go out on.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that it seems like their relationship was so well formed, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and that they really worked well as a team all throughout.
Mm-hmm.
Like at the beginning when they were at the boarding house, and then when Youngjin came to Japan, it seemed like they were always a team and that they were always having each other's back, and then having her last words be, "This is all your fault,"
Mm-hmm.
kind of, I don't know, it was a letdown for me. It felt almost out of character.
Yeah. And although the relationship between Youngjin and Sunja is now kind of closing, at least in the mortal realm of things, we do get some more relationships that do blossom in these last few chapters. And mainly they revolve around Solomon.
Yes.
So we learned that when Hana comes to the lives of Atsuko and Mozazu, she also starts infiltrating the life of Solomon.
Yes.
Now, from the description of things, she sounds bored. She sounds like she's trying to find things to do. And Solomon seems to be that project that she does pick up.
Maybe less of a project and more of her toy.
Right. It definitely seemed initially that she didn't really care about him. She was using him to kind of spend time and just kind of find a way to pass the moments that she was there. But I think she does eventually pick up a fairly deep love interest within Solomon.
I don't think she had that feeling for him the way that Solomon had those feelings for her. I think, at least from how I read it, it seemed as though she picked up on that and decided to just keep leaning on that. Like, yes, maybe, I think rather than a love relationship, I feel as though Hana saw more of a friendship in him.
Which is what she initially stated. And now this is a little bit of content warning because they do go into a lot of like sexual activities with each other. But Hana ends up being Solomon's first love, and she introduces him to sex and different activities. Now at this point, Hana is 17. She's much more experienced, and Solomon is 14 and has no experience, is not really even sure what's going on. He just knows that he finds Hana pretty.
Right.
Hana is someone that ends up relying on a lot of alcohol and sex to fill some space in terms of what I think is emptiness for her. Maybe that comes from a parental aspect. It sounds like she had a lot of bullying and different torturous aspects of childhood as she was growing up. So this is something that she brings with her when she does end up in Tokyo. Now, at this time, when she is hanging out with Solomon, she definitely says, I'm just in it for the playfulness. I'm not looking to be in a relationship. I'm not trying to marry you.
Right.
But when we start looking at their relationship when it comes towards an end, that's where I think Hana starts turning over and saying, oh, I really did love you, especially after all those other men I've been with. I've noticed that I loved you for how kind you are. So I think she did have a love for Solomon. I just don't think she realized it at that time.
That's fair. I think it goes beyond the parental emptiness. I think she just doesn't have any meaningful purpose in her life. Even though Solomon sees so much potential in her, sees her as smart, sees her as capable, she doesn't see that in herself. And even though Solomon speaks this over her, she doesn't affirm it for herself. Therefore, she doesn't see any reason to make anything solid in her life.
Right, because at one point she even talks about how she thinks that the only thing she's good for is flirting and sex.
Yeah.
She even mentions herself as Solomon's dirty flower.
Yeah.
So she doesn't even see herself as someone who's pure or clean. So it definitely plays a lot into that relationship of the lack of, I don't want to say self-esteem, but more just self-nurturing and self-care. Which eventually leads up to her feeling like she can't uphold her end of the relationship maybe, but she feels the need to leave. She no longer feels like she's able to be in that house with Atsuko, Solomon, and Mozazu. And so she does.
Disappear. Yes. Even though there are so many people who care for her, yes. She disappears, and it seems more of like she wants to find independence without having any reason for it.
So this then leads Solomon to grow up a little bit more. It sends him to going with the wishes of Mozazu. He ends up going to college in America and ends up meeting Phoebe.
Yes.
So Phoebe is someone he meets while he's in the States and ends up being someone that he's possibly looking to marry. He brings her back to Tokyo in 1989 because he ends up getting a job with a British investment bank. And this is where we start learning more about the relationship of Phoebe and Solomon.
And how, even though they come from the same heritage, they have a different upbringing. Solomon was born and raised in Japan, while Phoebe was born and raised in Seattle, Washington. So Japanese perspective versus the US American perspective, and this makes so many clashes. Like, even though Phoebe seems to be a very understanding person for the most part, because she moves to Tokyo and loses all of her friends, she loses all of her ability to work, and she's just stuck at home. And that is what kind of starts tearing the both of them apart.
Right. She neither speaks the language of Japanese. She also is more hurt by the bigotry she's seeing in Japan against Korean people.
Right.
Some of it is dealing with the passports, like her saying, why do we need a North or South Korean passport? Like, we're just one Korea.
Right.
Something that Solomon has obviously gotten used to at this point.
Right.
The other big thing is the relationship that we start to see with Phoebe as she comes into contact with Sunja and Kyunghee. So there's a moment where Solomon now brings Phoebe back home and wants to introduce her to his family.
Right.
So even in the way that she speaks to the grandparents, she speaks in Korean, whereas we see Solomon speak to his grandparents in Japanese, just showing the difference in culture.
Right.
The other big thing is Sunja and Kyunghee kind of ask about her family, and Phoebe says, oh, my family is a bunch of different cultures. We have someone who's black, someone who's Filipino, we have someone who's, I forget, pretty much all the different spectrums of culture and races. The other major thing that I think that came out of this conversation was the time that Sunja and Kyunghee were talking to Phoebe about food. Phoebe had noticed that Sunja was putting pajeon on the pan. And she's like, oh, is that pajeon? And then Sunja then follows up with, how does your mom make pajeon? And Phoebe answers that her mom doesn't.
Right.
Then the conversation goes to the fact that Phoebe doesn't know how to cook. Phoebe is much more adept to the life and culture of eating fast food or eating food out and things like that.
Right.
And Sunja and Kyunghee are stunned at this moment.
They're stunned, but the overall idea that they have is, regardless of her not being able to cook, regardless of her coming from a completely different upbringing, regardless of all that, they still think of her as marriage material for Solomon.
Right, absolutely. But the reason why I think this food part was so interesting was that Sunja and Kyunghee had to rely on food to get them through life.
Yeah.
Like when they were in the most impoverished times, they used their kimchi business and their candy business to actually support the entire family.
Totally.
So I think that change of Phoebe's family not focusing on making food was this dissonance in their lifestyles of like, okay, like how does that happen? Like how are you not concerned about this issue? And it definitely went out of the way to say that they weren't judging her for it.
No.
They were just more curious about what her life was.
Absolutely.
And then, after talking about food, they do the most typical grandmother harmony nanai thing of asking when they're going to get married, asking if they're going to have children. And I think this is the start of the downfall of the relationship of Solomon and Phoebe.
Yes. But beyond that, I think Phoebe is just frustrated too. So beyond the differences that they have, the fact that she's separated from all the things that she loves and knows that she cannot get back if she stays in Tokyo, this is when she specifically is like, I gotta go, gonna leave, bye.
And Solomon very much respects that.
Right.
But at the same point, I think it's because Solomon has now reconnected with the life of Hana. And even though Hana is on her deathbed and she is ready to pass, I think that relationship sparks a feeling within Solomon that he has to stay in Japan. And eventually makes the decision that he wants to no longer pursue the goal of working in a big American bank or factory or something, but wants to end up working with his father in the Pachinko parlor.
Yes.
Which is a recommendation from Hana.
Right. Before we move on, going back to that relationship with Hana, what are your thoughts? I think this is a very big gray area in that since Musazu's son is Solomon and Atsuko's daughter is Hana, and Hana and Solomon are getting intimate, and so technically they're step-siblings.
Yeah, I wasn't as bothered by that because they were still fairly big strangers. Like they had no actual connection in terms of bloodline or relationships prior. So they're still just random people with each other.
Fair.
The part that I had more of an issue with was the age.
That's something that I had issue with too. I don't know what's the laws that say whether or not a person is of age to be intimate. Which
Japan just changed. I think it used to be like 13 and now it's 16. I think it was like this year that they just changed it. Yeah, because it was a big deal. But yes, either way, there's a big imbalance of power.
Yes.
Solomon has no idea what's going on.
Right.
This, in some ways, reminds me of Hansu and Sunja way back in the beginning.
Yes, exactly. That full circle moment.
Right,
yes.
Right. So let's talk about other full circle moments from there.
So, speaking of Sunja and Hansu, earlier in the book, Hansu gives Sunja a watch, and Musazu gives Atsuko a watch as well. And what does he call it?
A mistress watch.
Yes. And I think it's so interesting that he gives this to her after buying her 3 different engagement rings. And his reasoning was, well, if you don't want to marry me, but you still want to be with me, I guess you're my mistress.
I don't know if that was his necessary reasoning. I think he just wanted to show his affection for her and wanted to show commitment. I think because she kept denying him the engagement ring,
Right.
he just didn't know where else to go. And I think this was the next step, because I can't remember if the jeweler even alluded to doing this move. But it's something that he definitely was trying to figure out. How do I get this person to be the person that is with
Committed
me?
to me.
Yeah. But yeah, it's very interesting because Hansu never mentioned that the watch was a mistress gift. He just gave it to her as a gift because he felt bad that she was pregnant.
Right, but then at the same token, he also asked her to be his mistress. So I think that was a mistress watch.
Okay. So another full circle moment is the outcomes that we see with Solomon and the comparison with Noah.
Yes.
So we see Solomon, who Mozazu has given so much to him that he can now go to school. He doesn't have to worry about other things. Mozazu is able to send him to an English school, give him everything that he needs, and ends up being extremely book smart and does very well to the point where he gets a very good bank job.
Very prestigious, too.
Right. Now, he's on this career path to do extremely well, and there's this whole issue with Kazu where he just really screws over Solomon.
Yeah.
But it eventually leads Solomon to come to the decision that he wants to work at the Pachinko parlor.
Yes.
So, once again, maybe somewhat influenced by Hana, but he comes to a very definitive point of, I want to work with my dad in getting this Pachinko parlor.
Right.
Now, the interesting conclusion, and it's something that you had mentioned, is that Noah, who was also on a very good path, he wasn't provided everything, but he started getting the things that he needed, especially as he got to college.
Right.
But with the whole turmoil of his identity, he ended up having to be forced into that Pachinko role.
Right. So it's full circle, but it's also a divergent circle. So speaking of Mozazu, this leads us to the next theme, which is a prediction fulfillment. In that Mozazu worked so hard so that his family was taken out of poverty to the point that he's a millionaire. I did not realize that's how well he was doing. And I knew that Mozazu was going to be the golden child. He may not have had book smarts, but he was so well adapted to people's intentions. So he knew how to, it's either fight or stand up for himself, as well as understanding the society he's in, knowing that he still wants to bring honor to his family, which meant for him, even though he's in the pachinko business, he wasn't going to take dirty money. He was going to do everything by the book.
Right. And I think that kind of leads me into some of the more final thoughts of this book, kind of looking at it as a whole.
Yeah.
So that story of Mozazu was so interesting because there's always that strong comparison between Mozazu and Noah.
Right.
I think Mozazu had accepted the position that he was in. He, from an early age, he knew his role of being a Korean in Japan. He was bullied, so he knew that he was never going to be Japanese.
Right.
Whereas when we look at Noah's life, Noah always wanted to be Japanese. He went out of the way to be the best and smartest kid in school. He always tried to be the most respectable person. And so he tried to play this game of trying to become someone that he wasn't.
Right.
And so no matter how hard he worked, he wouldn't become that person.
Right.
And then with that bombshell of finding out that his father, Hansu, is a Yakuza, having to hide his own culture and his own race from the family that he now had.
Right.
I think that all built up to what finally happened to Noah.
Yes, exactly. So unfortunate. But yes.
There's a quote in this book that I thought was really interesting, and it's said by Atsuko, and it's in a much bigger term of how she describes the similarities within her father's life and Mozazu's life, because her father is a traveling salesman for, I think, life insurances. And so what she mentions is that he kind of preys on their loneliness, their insecurities, tries to play on the time,
Right.
which is also what Mozazu does. So she's saying, like, why are they different?
Right.
But within this, she mentions this quote: "Every morning, Mozazu and his men tinkered with the machines to fix the outcomes. There could only be a few winners and a lot of losers. And yet, we played on, because we had hoped that we might be the lucky ones. How could you get angry at the ones who wanted to be in the game?" If I could put this whole book into one statement, that would be it.
Totally.
It's all about trying to maneuver and push around this game that has been placed upon you, and what can you do with that? Because sometimes the game's going to be slotted against you.
Right.
Most of the times the game's not going to want you to win.
Right.
But what can you do to make that outcome come into your favor? And that last part of, how are you angry at the people that still want to be in this game?
Right.
That's Mozazu. Mozazu wants to be in this game, and that's how he
Right.
succeeds. Noah wanted to figure out how to fit himself into the game.
Right.
And that became a big issue.
Right. Totally. Oh, so many good moments, so many full circles.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing, and it kind of brings us to the end,
Mm.
the last scene with Sunja.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of brings us back to where we all started.
Mhm.
It started with Huni, it started with Youngjin and Sunja, and how Sunja had to make these hard decisions. And rather than trying to fit into the society like Noah tried to, she instead just kept doing what she knew she could do. Very similar to Mozazu.
Mm-hmm. I think of this book as a start and finish, and I think of it as the start as Sunja's story and the finish as Solomon's story. I think a lot of the story revolves around who Sunja is, from her parents to grandparents to what she had to do to raise it,
Yeah.
and then that kind of became the cause, and then the effect was Solomon, and him not only be able to go to a great school, get an education, have more freedoms and not have to work as hard,
Right.
but also to then make that decision of what he wanted to do, which is something as
Right.
simple as going back to the Pachinko parlor.
Right. Definitely.
Did you have any other final thoughts on this book, and would you recommend this book to someone else?
Final thoughts, and this is not just on this section, but specifically in both books 2 and 3. Although I love the story, Min-Jin Lee does a beautiful job of creating these characters, creating these scenarios, and making them weave all together. And I enjoyed it very much. I guess my only thing is that in books 2 and 3, the events and the characters started splashing in and out. To the point where, and I mean, it's like life. Like life, people come and go in our lives, but I feel as a book, it was a lot to take in as a reader. However, in the end, yes, I do recommend this book. I do still think it's worth the hype.
And I get what you mean. Like, the stories of Haruki and Ayami, like,
Right.
we don't know what happens with that. We do know what happens with Yosef. Very brief.
Very quickly, it's like, oh, there's no mourning period for Yosef. It's like, oh, finally, gone.
Which was the theme of the book. Maybe not theme, but that's the consistency of the book. Was
Right.
the characters entered so fluidly, but the exit was very quick. And I wonder if that was placed there for a reason, in the sense of that's how life works, is we don't have time to really linger on these deaths of people
Right.
that live in our lives. Because like Huni says, we kind of got to go into the next day. We got to keep moving on.
Gotcha. For sure.
I really like this book, but only in this last read. I think, like you said, in book 2, it just felt like the characters were bouncing in and out. A lot of the times, I just kept thinking, who are we going to focus on? Like,
Right.
if I had a camera, it was just moving back and forth, and I didn't know really where I should look.
at.
But now being able to sit back and stare at the whole story, like I said, I think it's the story of Sunja and Solomon. It's the story of how did our older generations grow so that we can now thrive.
For sure, yes.
I see this whole thing kind of like a puzzle. Like, reading it through, it was trying to find the pieces. So I'm finding the corner pieces. Like, where is our base? Opening up that whole frame and saying, like, okay, where is this going to come? And then once you start getting towards like 70% done, then a lot more of the picture starts to show. So then you're just putting in pieces. So I think this last part of the read, I was like, oh, this makes so much more sense. I can see where you wanted to go with it. But for so much of the book, I agree. I think I was a little bit more lost than I wanted to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but definite recommend.
Yes.
I think the story has a lot of ties to relationship things, a lot of ties to... Personally, for me, it made me think of my own grandmother.
For sure.
It made me think of her life because she grew up within the Korean War. She had different things like night terror. So thinking about what Sunja went through, it made me really consider what could my grandmother have been through, because I know the life, a little bit of what she lived, but I was always afraid to ask her. And so I believe that she probably had a story, probably something wild where she had to go through desperation, where she had to fight. And that's what helped my dad get to the point where he could go to college. Because my dad, she was a single mom. He had to work from junior high to pay for himself through college. And then he moved to the States so that we can have an education. So I think for a lot of people, from that aspect, you might be able to relate, because recently I've been starting to see my parents as human, and I think that's what this book does, is it starts to make your relatives who have paved this pathway from the earth and just continue to rise up to turn them into humans who also struggled.
Right. Absolutely. So I guess that means that we both recommend the book.
Yes.
We recommend that if you are going to read it with your parents, have your parents read it without you.
Yeah. I don't know if you recommend it. I would also say, like, it might be better, because we broke this up so much.
Right.
If you are going to read this book, maybe read through it quickly.
Yeah. I think with us ruminating on it, it made us focus a lot more on the plot holes, I guess, or not necessarily plot holes. It's just we were focusing a lot on the things that pulled us out of the story.
I think we started focusing on the individual journeys rather than the whole story.
Yeah. For sure.
So I think that's, in ways it was good, like with Little Fires Everywhere. It was really good to be able to see piece by piece.
Right.
And even this one, I would argue that it was really good to see someone like the life of Etsuko and really be able to fixate on how she grew up and see how that manipulated Hana's growing up, which then manipulates Solomon's final ideas of deciding his decisions.
His own pathway.
Exactly. So I think there was some benefit to it, but if I were to just want to enjoy the story, I probably would just read it in one go.
Totally. I think for me, if I were to reread this, I would read it by book.
Right.
Instead of breaking it down the way that we did. We did it because of the chunks, to make it even chunks, but I think for me, the easiest way would be to chunk it by book, because it is by generation, essentially.
Right. Okay. So we will be doing a watch of this book, which is on Apple TV.
Yes.
That'll be the next episode that you hear. But after that will be our next book. And this next book is going to be Jamae's choice.
Yes.
Now, we're changing things up a little bit.
Just a little bit.
So the way that we're going to start doing the reveal of the next book is kind of all within the tail end of this episode.
Yes.
So Jamae is going to give me 3 hints, her hint of jam.
Yeah.
And she's going to give me 3 options.
Yes.
In which I am going to try to figure out what that book is.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Jamae.
So, hint number 1. This debut novel is written by an acclaimed writer and activist whose work has appeared in the LA Times, the NYT Book Review, and Best American Food Writing 2019, among many other publications. Second hint is that this book is a magical realism book, fiction, And the third hint is that it includes aswang. And aswang in the Filipino folklore is a shape-shifting mythical creature that eats humans.
So it's also Filipino.
Yes.
Okay. Secret fourth hint.
Yes. So, what book is it? A. A Tiny Upward Shove by Melissa Chadbourne. B. America is Not the Heart by Elaine Castillo. Or C. Arsenic and Adobo by Mia P. Manansala.
Interesting. So this is magical realism.
Yes.
So I feel like I've seen the cover of Arsenic and Adobo, which is what I'm going to go based off of. So I'm going to say C.
The answer is A.
Oh. Boo.
So, the book that we're reading next is A Tiny Upward Shove by Melissa Chadbourne, who appears in many publications. Her focus in advocacy is in upending economic violence, and you can also find her work in Netflix, of all places. So, let's take a look at the book. On the book's cover, you see a silhouette of a person with just their eyes showing, which kind of alludes to the aswang nature. And the book's description says, A Tiny Upward Shove is inspired by Melissa Chadbourne's Filipino heritage and its folklore, as it traces the too short life of a young cast-off woman transformed by death into an agent of justice, or mercy. Marina Salas's life does not end the day she wakes up dead. Instead, in the course of a moment, she is transformed into the stuff of myth, the stuff of her grandmother's old Filipino stories, an aswang, a creature of mystery and vengeance. She spent her time on Earth on the margins, shot like a pinball through a childhood of loss. She was a veteran of Child Protective Services and a survivor, but always reacting, watching from a distance, understanding very little of her own life, let alone the lives of others. Death brings her into the hearts and minds of those she has known, even her killer, as she accesses their memories and sees anew the meaning of her own. In her 9 days as an aswang, while she considers whether to exact vengeance on her killer, she also traces back, finally able to see what led these two lost souls to a crushingly inevitable conclusion.
Nice.
Yeah.
So what is going to be our first read?
Our first read is going to be pages 3 through 88, which starts in the chapter called Tinikling and ends with the chapter called Pork is a Seasoning.
Mm-hmm. And so we're separating this book into 4 chunks. Okay, nice. So read along with the next one, but our next episode will be that special episode of Pachinko the Show on Apple TV.
Yes.
And if you want to get into our discussions, if you want to talk to us about your opinions on Pachinko, or if you had any different viewpoints or things that you noticed, how can people talk to us?
You can email us at asianbookclubpod@gmail.com, or you can get in our DMs or write to us in the comments on Instagram at asianbookclubpod.
We also have our website, which is asianbookclubpod.com, which also has our bookshop, which is going to give the recommendations for books that we've already read or books that we're planning to read.
Yep.
Otherwise, we hope that you've enjoyed reading Pachinko with us.
Yes.
Make sure to be happy, be healthy, and go read a book.
Ingat.
Bye.
Bye.